All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started this morning. I'm finally back. I've been gone various places for 4 different weeks, just mostly seeing family, but we went to Philadelphia one weekend. We've been out of town a little bit, so thanks to Hans for filling in. I was able to catch most of his classes online, and as always, he does a good job of teaching, but also making sure people are paying attention by calling on people to make sure they're paying attention. So I always appreciate that. Um, what I thought we'd do this morning, give people a little bit of time to get set down, is we'll go ahead and say a prayer together before we get started, but we'll pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 19. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for allowing us to come here to study your word together. Help us to focus on you and focus on understanding your word as what it says and not necessarily just what we think about it, but what your word actually says, and help us to take it to heart. We thank you for everything that you've given us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 19, but I thought, one, since I haven't been here in a while, I'm sure people have been in and out for holidays, we could do a little bit of review. So I thought I'd touch on some of the things that, I thought about it, like watching the classes and preparing the classes, but also want to hear from you all. So we've kind of covered David's life while he's been a king. The first lesson we went over was talking about how David had messed up with Bathsheba and the consequences he faces of losing a child there, and also how some of those things continue to affect even what we'll talk about today and what we've talked about the past couple weeks. And then there was the whole situation with Tamar and how David didn't necessarily handle that the best way that he could, which led to what happened with Absalom and the strife that's going on there. I think last week you all covered kind of the death of Absalom and like David mourning the fact that he died, which we know would be very difficult and challenging. So that kind of gets us up to where we are today. But since it had been a while, I thought if anybody had any thoughts on things that have really stuck out to them, that we've studied so far in the quarter, it would be cool to share, to hear what you all think, or anything that's touched your lives is applicable before we get started. So does anybody have any thoughts from previous classes before we get going? If not, that's okay too. Yeah.
You can't just ignore when things happen. You have to deal with them, whether you like doing it or not.
Yep.
You have to, if they have an issue, do something wrong, you have to correct it. And not only for them, but also for the other child, because the other child will suffer, and it won't be as extreme as this probably, but it might be that the other child, let's say one child is very outspoken and domineering, and the other child is laid back. And if you allow that other child to continue to dominate and be mean to the child, that other child just becomes a shell of himself.
Yeah.
And so, from my own personal standpoint, I made that mistake. I was too laid back as a parent. And so, I would say to anybody who isn't a parent yet, don't ever, you have to be a parent, you don't, not necessarily a friend.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And as a parent, just like even David as a king, you have like a different perspective than your kids in the moment might, because you have, in theory, eyes on the bigger picture, kind of what they need for them to be successful in life and what they need for them to be successful Christians. And you also see how they interact with each other versus like me, when I'm interacting with my brother, I am almost always thinking about like, what does this mean for me? What am I mad about? That kind of stuff. But like, hopefully my dad and mom can see like, oh, these are the things that they could be, doing better to interact better. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And like, I know you all have covered some other things, but a lot of what's been covered so far with David has been either directly or indirectly about, how he's reacted and done things with his kids. And I think today we will cover we'll still talk about that because it affects things, but also think like, what does how you rule your household affect like other people? And for David, that was like the whole nation of Israel, right? Like all of these things aren't just affecting David and Absalom or David and whoever he's working with in his own household. Like there's a whole kingdom that is being affected by what's going on here. And I think we can, like, in the back of our minds, draw some parallels to, like, when we have turmoil in the church, it doesn't affect our families, right? Like it can affect the whole church that we're a part of, or can even hurt our ability to spread the gospel. And that doesn't mean those things aren't going to come up, but it's important for us to kind of keep in mind the impact that everything has. So good point. Any other quick thoughts before we get going this morning? All right. If not, I know you all touched on this last week too, but I thought it was good by way of review, for us to go ahead and pick up in verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 19. So is someone able to read 2 Samuel 19 verses 1 through 8 for me?
Then it was told Joab, behold, the king is weeping and mourns for Absalom. The victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. So the people went by stealth into the city that day, as people who are humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. The king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you and by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that princes and servants are nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak loudly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now."
All right, thank you. So here we see, before we kind of get into what David does about all this, we see that he is mourning, like you all talked about last week, and that is keeping him from doing what he needs to do, from serving his purpose, right? And there's a very hard balance here, because we can feel sympathetic or even empathetic to him about, you've just lost your child. And this isn't even the first time that David has done this, where he's lost a child. And that's not one of those things that's like, oh, I've dealt with this before, so it's easier. Sometimes in life there are things where it's like, oh, we've had this emotional thing happen. I've had to go through this. So like the next time this happens, it won't be as hard. Like, one, we know for this type of situation that's just not true. But also, like, David, I feel like, if we think back to what we studied the first week, actually like handles this one worse than he did, when the child died. He ate and he went back to doing what he was supposed to be doing, right? And so there's a lot of reasons that could be, but like part of the reason I wanted to start with reviewing this passage is just that we have to like keep in mind what our ultimate goal and what our ultimate direction and purpose is in life, and that is to serve God and do what we're supposed to do for him. Right? And that doesn't mean that when we have grief and we have things happen, that we don't need time to process that we don't need time to work through that. We need help in those moments. We need time to process it and things like this. But I think David also, in this case, Joab has to come kind of be like, you got to move on. Like, you've got this whole nation, you've been so focused on your family, you've got this whole nation of people that is like waiting on you to do something, and you're not doing anything. And think about what all you're causing out here. And I think the application for us is, sometimes we can get so caught up in our grief or what's going on in our lives that we don't take care of the responsibilities that we have to the Lord. And we're each charged with like different things and different responsibilities there. But I think that's why it's important for us to like keep our ultimate goal in mind. But also, running parallel to that, oftentimes once you've had the time to process that grief, the healing process works better if you're around other people and like doing things for other people and like making those decisions. And so it's going to be hard for David to come out of his grief if he stays holed off in a way. And so I think those are all things that I just wanted to mention quickly as we get into the text this morning, because they're going to, affect how we might think about decisions that David makes. but he's got to kind of deal with all of the things that happened during the strife with Absalom, and the repercussions of that. So any quick thoughts on, how we deal with, what we've read in the passage here about like rebuking and things like that? Yeah.
Just a comment that one of the things that strikes you is David, in his role as king, has certain responsibilities, but then he's still a private individual. And you think back to like President Lincoln, who lost some sons while he was in office, and you need to mourn, but there's so much else going on that you can't. And of course, with David, a special situation when your son has actually been trying to kill you,
Right.
and has resulted in 20,000 casualties. It's hard for people around you to see your grief. And as Joab said, would you rather have him kill you and kill all of us and be alive? Is that what you're actually saying?
Yeah, and I mean, even if that is how he felt in the moment, like, what does that mean to all those people who didn't follow Absalom when it looked like he was going to be the one who was going to win this fight, right? Like, he had the more power, and he had all these people leaving to follow him, and like David's like, what's he saying to the people who like trusted David and like continued to support him by like saying they're not important to him? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Any other quick thoughts before we move on to the text this morning? All right, let's pick up in chapter 19, verses 9 through 15, if somebody wants to read 2 Samuel 19, 9 through 15. All right.
All the people were quarreling throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. However, Absalom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now then, why are you silent about bringing the king back?" Then King David sent to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, saying, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house, since the word of Israel has come to the king, even to his house? You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? Say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? May God do so to me and more also, if you will not be a commander of the army before me continually in the place of Joab." Thus he turned the hearts of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, saying, "Return, you and all your servants." The king then returned and came as far as the Jordan. And Judah came to Gilgal in order to go to meet the king, to bring the king across the Jordan.
All right, thank you. So we've got a couple different things that I want us to call out and focus on here. First, kind of this chunk in verses 9 and 10. So my understanding after studying through all of this is that you kind of have like the Israel, the northern tribes who mostly followed Absalom, and then you have like the southern tribes in Judah that like stuck with David. But we've got here in verse 9, so those who went with Absalom, right, trying to figure out what they're going to do about this, right? So they've like, and let's put ourselves in their shoes first. So let's say we had this opportunity where, there's rivalry in power or whatever we want to get into, that there's son and father and all that, but like we've got to decide who we're going to follow. And then you are the person, and so you're part of the group that was actually probably the larger group, but that backed the wrong guy. And so then the other guys won. What's going through your mind right now? Like, what are you thinking and feeling if you're the one who's backed the wrong guy? Like, what are you feeling? Yeah. Like, they're probably like, David has every right to come destroy us or have retribution in some way, right? Like, I think as I was thinking through this, I thought a lot of parallels, and not all the situations were handled the same, but like in the Civil War in the U.S., right? Like there were a lot of things that could have been done better or could have been done worse, and like we'll see, how that plays out for David. But I think it would be very easy for those that followed Absalom to be thinking about like what's he going to do to us, physically. Are there any other things that might be going through their mind? I feel like there also is the potential for like a power vacuum, because we'll see some things even in later chapters where other challengers come up, even though this battle or this skirmish itself has been finished. There's like, hey, we might still have the numbers here. Should we appoint someone else to like go and do this while we've got this chance to take David down? Or like the third thing I might be thinking in my mind is like, okay, I might say all of this is David's fault. Should he be the one that's king? Like I know that like clearly God is backing him because he won these fights and he's been talking to him and stuff. But like if I'm thinking about this just from like a war and conquest perspective, I'm like, all of this can be tied back to David. So like, why should we trust him as king? But I think in verse 10, you also see the reality of this situation, right? But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? So it's like, really, at the end of the day, your leader not being there anymore in a lot of situations discharges a lot of things, right? Like if you're, on.
A time of great confusion.
Yeah.
Who's in charge? And of course, one of the reasons Joab, jumped on David was that there's this vacuum. You've got to act now to do something. You can't go off and mourn for a couple of weeks because now you need to take the reins again.
Right.
And of course, it's interesting. You're probably going to talk about that next. But one of the things he does is he appoints Amasa, the new commander of the army, kind of to get back at Joab. But also, it's just amazing because he appoints the commander under Absalom to be the new commander of the army.
Yeah, and like we can go ahead and go there a little bit in that, like back to that parallel, right? Like that would be like if Abraham Lincoln was like, I'm going to appoint Lee to be the general of the United States Army now, and clearly that's not a perfect parallel, but like the shock value of that, like to people seeing this and like what that would mean, would be paralleled in that sense. So I think that's, an amazing thing that David does that we'll touch on a little bit more too. But like, it's interesting, like some of the choices David makes here, I'm like, that makes complete sense to me. And some of the choices he makes, it's like, that seems questionable, but like we all do that in life. So we've got, the people who left and followed Absalom, but then you've also got a surprising group of people in verses 11 and 12, right, where it says, and King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of Israel has come to the king? You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And so here we see David is even kind of questioning, like, the people who should be backing me and saying, okay, David, come back, like, get back to work, are the last people to, like, approach him about, like, saying, hey, you should come back. So I think that's interesting, too, and, like, there's a whole lot of things that we could consider or think about, like, hypotheticals of why that might be the case. But I also, as I was studying and reading some other people's thoughts on this, something that I thought that was interesting that was brought up as a thing for us to consider is oftentimes, whether it's spiritual in nature or not, when we expect support from someone or some group, it doesn't always come from there. And sometimes the support or encouragement or whatever we get comes from a completely unexpected source or something, someone who's even been adversarial to us in the past. And so I think sometimes it's important for us to remember that, like, encouragement and exhortation might come from areas that we don't expect. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to it. Any thoughts on why, Judah was hesitant to reach out to David? Yeah.
They didn't know exactly what was going to happen to him because they did follow him. And, I don't know about his reign at that point in time. I can't think of it, but maybe they were living good at that point in time under Absalom,
Mm-hmm.
And so now they're saying, if we go back with David, are we going to be back in the same situation we were before? So a lot of things could be.
And, yeah, the general uncertainty and just like, I think it gets back to something that we hit on before too, of like, they may also be thinking, we know David well, we've seen all the mistakes he's made. Do we like trust this guy to actually be able to come back and do things right this time. So I think there's a lot of different things that we can consider there. But ultimately, and then we get to what kind of Hans mentioned before, where Amasa is made the commander of the army over Joab. So, he already described this situation of where you've got the likely commander of Absalom's army based on the chapters that we've studied before, who is now put in charge, who is replacing Joab, who was in charge of David's army. I have some thoughts on why some of these things were done, but what do you all think? Why did David choose to do this? What would be some of the benefits, I guess, to start with of doing this? Yeah.
It might calm some fears about people thinking that they betrayed him, and
Yeah.
look, I'll take the enemy as my head guy. So
Right. I think that's probably the biggest and by far what I would think would be the benefit of this in theory is that if we take someone who was we'll call one of the main traitors from the other side and say, you know what, we figured out a way to reconcile here. He's going to lead the unified army or whatever now, that makes sense for reconciliation. Any other thoughts there before we focus on what might be bad about that? Yeah.
Or kind of remove some of the fears of retribution. I mean,
Yeah.
because the typical thing would be to do if you just had a civil war, you're going to root out all the people that, were disloyal and stood against you. And here, David is, by this gesture, he's actually showing them that, I can understand you made a mistake supporting my son, but they've also seen him actually mourning that son. So
Yeah.
they realize David is going to be king for all of us. He's not just going to come in and be busy punishing everyone.
Yeah. I think that's, a good reason as to why he might have done it as well. Yeah, Jesse?
So, at this point, he really couldn't trust Joab. Joab had betrayed him and going directly against his orders. He'd been insubordinate.
Yeah. Yep. So I think those are all good points as to why. What might be some of the downsides of this as a choice? Yeah.
Still on the other one.
All right, that's fine.
This whole process is a great model of forgiveness on David's part. He's forgiving the enemy. He's putting the enemy leader back into a position of authority and so forth. And that ultimately is God's model, with Christ at the cross and forgiving mankind. And we are all called to forgive, in any and every circumstance and situation. So we see this great spiritual thing going on with David, while at the same time he's such a mess up.
Yeah.
He's messed things up so badly, but then he has these moments. So
Right. Yeah.
that's why he's a favorite character.
And I think that should encourage us, like you're saying, because we're going to mess up, but that doesn't mean that we can't also have these moments. And it's, in my mind, about striving make the mess ups less and the good moments more, and that's part of our Christian growth. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes, this is a very convoluted situation. So the whole point that I don't know, David's in mourning, so obviously his mind is not on the right path, but the whole reason why Absalom and him even got together was because of Joab. Joab was the one who reached out to him. Joab was the one who kind of helped them bond and get together again. But yet Joab also could see beyond just the father-son relationship and, hey, this guy's going to take over if you don't act. And so he did what David couldn't do and acted more like a king than David did.
Yeah. And that's why this gets so tricky, right? Did Joab overstep his bounds on what he was told to do? Yes, he did. But it's was he also part of the reason some of the good things happened? Yes, he was. From what we've seen, I mean, we know God had a strong hand in this too, but was as I flip to the negatives, if you were saying who won this battle, was it Joab or Amasa? Joab won as a military leader, right? So now you're about to say, let me take the guy who lost and put him in charge of our military, which is foreshadowing might have problems later on to come. And so again, it's tricky because we have so many of these moving pieces, but it's like, and then the last thing that I had like kind of as a negative is like, it's hard for me not to believe that like David has a little bit of his personal involvement here in this decision of like, Joab, I'm mad at you. Like, there is the king military commander relationship, but the fact that it's Absalom, like, there's a personal thing going on here too. And so I think that what I was going to mention here, it's not written for us, all of these discrete things, but I think it is interesting for us to think about, like, how can we make accurate and good decisions when we're dealing with that grief or when we're dealing with a tough situation? And like, my takeaway before I open it up to you all is, especially if there's like personal things involved. So like, let's say, you know, we were going to appoint more elders or whatever, and like, I'm like really backing, you know, someone that I'm related to or whatever. Like, it's good to get other perspectives versus it just being, and like, that's the nice thing about the eldership process is like that there are lots of perspectives, you know, but just anything you think of in life, it's good to have multiple perspectives if you are personally and emotionally involved to kind of check you on that. So any quick thoughts there, last minute thoughts about David's decision? Yeah.
Just the idea that it's hard to see how they could have moved forward if Absalom was still alive. Mm-hmm. Because there's a figurehead. I know Caleb brought up in one class that there was kind of almost a mob mentality, but you have this colorful figure leading the way, and he'd also been kind of spreading these lies that, oh, well, you get no justice under David, he's incompetent, there are no judges to hear your cases. And so it's almost like Absalom has to be out of the way before this healing of the rift can take place.
Yeah. And like, if you're David, down in your heart, you might know that has to happen, but you're like, man, can't there be a way where we don't have to kill him and like he can just reconcile and all this? But like, you know, that wasn't the case. So yeah. Any other quick thoughts before we move on to the next passage? All right. If not, for the sake of time, I'm going to read verses 16 through 23, 2 Samuel 19, 16 through 23. And I'll probably butcher some of these names, but just bear with me. And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, from Bahurim, hurried to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And with him were 1,000 men from Benjamin, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and his 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king. And they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king, and as he was about to cross the Jordan, and said to the king, Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day of my lord, the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart. For your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, come down to meet my lord the king. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? But David said, What have I to do with you, the sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shimei, You shall not die. And the king gave his oath. All right, so we're transitioning a little bit from what we were talking about before to looking at how does David handle some of the specific situations from people he encountered during this time or before of the strife. And so what we're talking about here is we're looking at Shimei. And so, you know, the situation is, you know, he was against David. He even like cursed David and all of these bad things. And so, you know, the gist of what's probably going through his mind is like, what's going to happen to me because of all the things I did? Like, what is David going to do to me? And so what I thought was interesting that we could look at first, and I don't know that we'll be able to directly answer this question, is the thought, was Shimei genuine in his asking of forgiveness of David? Did he actually feel bad, or was he just going to cover for himself? Because we see, first of all, as soon as he like knows that David is returning, he runs down to meet him, which I feel like that's like a neutral, like it could be that he was truly sorry, so he goes down, or he's like, man, I need to head this off and take care of this as quickly as possible, right? And then it's like, okay, now I'm going to bring 1,000 men with me and all these different people with me. And again, it's like, are you doing that because you're worried about what's going to happen? Are you doing that because you want to have this big host of people to receive David and you want to make him, feel better? Or are you like trying to cover up, the fact that like you're not sincere in this apology, but you're bringing all these things, So we see as this happens, and then verse 19, it says, "Let not my Lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my Lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart. And for your servant knows that I have sinned." And like, that's like one of the first steps towards like repentance, right? Is like recognizing that you have sinned, actually saying those 3 words, like, I have sinned. If you don't do that and recognize it, not that it always has to be this public and, in front of thousands of people, but that seems like a good first genuine step towards like reconciling this situation. But then he goes on to say, I came down first. This was most important to, like all these qualifiers that I think sometimes we do when we're like, man, I really want to make sure this person believes me, and just makes it very hard to, know how genuine he was versus trying to cover himself. And it may have been a little bit of both. But first of all, with Shimei, what do you all think about that before we get into some of the other reactions here?
I think it was genuine because I think, and of course, I think part of it was you couldn't help but see God is with David, or he wouldn't have had this great victory against odds. But you have to remember that Shimei was, when David was fleeing and, was kind of downcast and thinking, everything was done, he's throwing mud and rocks and dirt on him and calling him man of blood and mocking him. And David held off then. Joab, would have cut his head off. Yeah. But you think Shimei, after he's done all this, he'd be stupid to go if he's afraid, if he's not genuine.
Right.
This guy's going to get him. And of course, we discussed earlier too, the tribe of Benjamin was one of the big supporters of Absalom. So the idea that there are 1,000 here, it's kind of like this tribe is making peace with David. So it's an important thing for David to handle this the way he does. And you couldn't help but think if Joab was still the commander, he probably would have cut the guy's head off immediately. So it's something that David is able to show mercy to him. And of course it helps bring this tribe back into the fold.
Yeah, and I think those are all, valid, these are definitely things that could be showing that like he was genuine and sincere with his apology. Yeah. But
it's interesting. It would be good to make a comparison between this meeting and the meeting of Jacob and Esau. After all of this, they've had their families and they're meeting again for the first time. The fact that Jacob sends his whole family and servants out in front of him before him is almost like well, if he starts killing all the serpents, then I know it's time to run. Whereas here we see, this guy comes out in front of all of his servants and family members and falls down before the king. He doesn't stop at the Jordan and go, hey, promise not to kill me and I'll come over the Jordan. He comes right over and throws himself in the most vulnerable position right in front of the king and says, I messed up, I'm sorry. Yeah, he obviously sweetens the pot a little bit, but hey, I was the first one and all of this, but like if he really was trying to only come out with his neck intact, he probably would have taken a few more precautions. It feels genuine that he straight up puts himself flat on the ground in front of David, in front of all his people.
Yeah. I think that's good. Any other thoughts there? Okay, so I said all that and like played both sides to make the point that like, and we have to separate like David as a king, like leading people spiritually from like, a military ruler and like all of that stuff too. But like, if we're in David's position, unless we can like directly detect that he's not genuine, it's not up to us to decide. Like if they are doing the things and they're coming to us to reconcile, like we are supposed to reconcile with people. Now, does that mean he needs to make Shimei the second in charge in his army or anything like that? Does he have to trust him to that level? No. But I think the point I wanted to make is there are things that we can do to discern people's hearts and see it based on their action. But at the point that they are coming and doing all these things to like ask for forgiveness of us, we shouldn't spend the next 3 days going, well, were they legitimate in that? Were they actually coming and like meaning it, right? Like we may see things 3 days later that make us believe that's completely not true, right? But in the moment, we are supposed to work to reconcile with other people. But it's also interesting, that right after this, Abishai says, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" Why might Abishai feel this way? Like, why does he feel so strongly towards this?
Could be personal grudges. Could just be, hey, I stuck with you and this guy was on the other side. Like, why should he get any better treatment?
Yeah. Something I found that I had not thought of as I was studying through this, but Exodus 22:28 says, "You shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people." And so we have the other side of this where Abishai might be thinking about this in Exodus, where it's like, we need to punish, like, how do you balance, like, God says you're not supposed to do this thing and you deciding what the punishment is versus not. So I think it's like a very difficult situation here, but we also understand where David's coming from, right? Because he's like, towards the end of this passage, if we keep on killing people, like, how are we going to have peace if we keep having like this retribution back and forth and different things like that? So it's like this balance of like, we get how that makes sense from a peace perspective, but also like balancing that with like following the laws of God and like doing those things. And so like, I think it's a very difficult situation here. I don't have the perfect answer for you all, but I think that's like a lot of times how it ends up being, right? It's not cut and dry and always easy for us, and it's a really messy situation. So anyway, I thought that was interesting as I was studying through that. And then one other passage real quick, if I can find it. Let me see. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, we see Shimei mentioned again, and it says, "And there is also with you Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day when I went to meet Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray head down with the blood to Sheol." So, and we may cover this in farther things with like David and Solomon, but we see this is not like the last time he's referred to, and like this stuff that he's done is not forgotten about either, right? So like, I think that what we have here in this direct text we're studying, we might say like, oh, David just lets him off the hook. This isn't like the whole story either. So anyway, because we've only got 5 minutes left, I'm going to read verses 24 through 30 so we can finish out the study for today. So 2 Samuel chapter 24, or 2 Samuel 19, chapter 20, or verse 24 through 30, if you want to follow along with me. "And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? He answered, My lord, O king, my servant deceived me, for your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I than to cry to the king? And the king said to him, Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided, you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. All right, we don't have a lot of time to dive into this. The first thing is I probably spent more time preparing for this class trying to get Mephibosheth's name down than anything else, and still messed it up. But I think we see a couple other interesting things in this interaction that I'll point out really quickly. So we have Mephibosheth, and we don't have a lot of time to go into his backstory, and we have Ziba. And basically the summary of the situation here is that Ziba misrepresents what Mephibosheth has done and said. He says he's slandered David, Ziba slandered David or Mephibosheth, saying that he had done all these things against David, which were not true. So Mephibosheth comes down, but David had said, like, Ziba, you can have all of the lands because of all these things Mephibosheth has done. So I think the first quick takeaway in my mind is, like, when you're in a leadership position, it's important that you, like, when you hear someone come to you and say something, especially if you don't know that they're trustworthy, for you to validate that information and, like, try to investigate and make decisions there. In Deuteronomy chapter, let's see here, another, like, Old Testament reference that we have that gives us some light on this is in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 16 and following. It says, if a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. So we have this accusal of, like, someone, slandering and all these things, and we have an example of what's supposed to be done to, like, get to the bottom of this situation. And from what we read here, we don't see that, like, David does that. And so I think this is important for us to keep in mind, is, like, this is why the tongue is such a dangerous thing, is, like, slander. God calls that out as wrong in many places because it can be so damaging. And you, like, Mephibosheth's life has changed after this moment because of this slander that Ziba did. And so it's important for us to, one, remember that we shouldn't slander other people, especially, when we're saying false things or whatever, but also when someone comes to badmouth somebody else to us, we need to be able to, like, validate that information if it is about making a decision on something rather than just taking their word for it, right? Like, we need to do our own investigation and, like, figure that out so we can make an appropriate decision. But then Mephibosheth still has a good attitude about this whole situation, right? Because David splits the land between Ziba and Mephibosheth, or that's what he says he's going to do. And in theory, he should have just given it all back to Mephibosheth because Ziba said these false things. But Mephibosheth is more focused on, like, the big picture and the fact that David's back rather than on, am I going to get what I deserve? And I think that's important for us to keep in mind here too. So we're at 10:15, so any quick thoughts before we close? Already got the countdown going, so they can't be long thoughts. All right, if not, we'll close with a quick prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much today for being able to study your word. Help it to guide us. Help us to make accurate decisions based on what's in your word and to try to take emotion and personal involvement out of it as much as we can. We can't always do that, but please help us to be guided by you and your word and those that we trust around us. In Jesus' name, amen.